Hi, this is Dr. Young. The purpose of this introductory video is to go through Chapter 1 of Mark Gilderhus's History and Historians as a tool for beginning to learn how to think historically or to inquire historically. And here I want to make a differentiation between the way that academic history is engaged and the way that maybe the popular imagination thinks about history. At some point in your life, you may have played a game like Trivial Pursuit, or you may have watched Jeopardy, or if you may have had the unfortunate experience in even a history class where you have to learn a lot of trivia, a lot of names and dates and events and these sorts of things, right? There was a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip many years ago where Calvin was asked a question on a test, which was when did the Pilgrims land on Plymouth Rock, and he wrote 1620, and then he said, I have memorized this useless fact so that I can write it on this exam, and now I plan to forget it forever, because there seems to be no utility to this. If you look at the question that Gilderhus poses here, can stories about the other peoples in other places and other times have any meaning in an age of vaulting technology and traumatizing change? This is the kind of question that starts to get us into the academic pursuit of history, where history is not just a sequence of one thing after another, one event, one person after another, one date after another, right? It actually has meaning. We can draw lessons from it, some of which we can apply today, and some of which, the process of which, when we're just looking at the way that past peoples understood the world around them, is that process instills in us some essential tools that are really valuable for for education, for life in general. And so one of the reasons that historical inquiry is something that is required in general education, both at Flagler College and I think more generally in American higher education, is that these skills about extracting meaning from the past, right? Engaging with the past in a way that's productive, that helps us, understand people on their own terms, that helps us to read closely and think critically and all of that. That's essential. That really is essential to become an educated person. There are a lot of skeptics of history. Henry Ford, for instance, was quoted as saying, history is bunk, it's just tradition. We don't want to think about tradition, we want to think about the present. Even such luminaries as Voltaire and Hegel and other philosophers have said we really can't learn much from the past. But I think historians, and certainly I, would disagree, right? Gilderhus here refers to some fairly recent, although I guess these aren't so recent anymore, within the last generation or so, some decisions that were made at the highest echelons of power in the American government, and in fighting wars and things like this, where people consulted the past, where they looked at precedent, they looked at the way things were done in previous times, and drew lessons from that, and they're not just like starting over, right? Past is prologue, and it's important that we learn that prologue. Cicero is quoted here as saying, Cicero, the ancient Roman historian, or I should say ancient Roman philosopher, is quoted as saying, to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. And so, that's important. If we don't understand what came before us, we have little sense of how we've gotten here and ultimately who we are. So history helps to create identity, right? Which is something that Gilderhus gets into in a little bit here. Let's see, this paragraph that I've highlighted here at the bottom, let me just read this. Undoubtedly, the study and writing of history have serious and risky implications. While faced with large and daunting responsibilities in their work, historians must confront their intellectual shortcomings, their incomprehension of the workings of the world, and their limited capacity to interpret their evidence, which is almost always messy, incomplete, and susceptible to different forms of understanding. This is actually one of the great benefits of history. The historical record is incomplete, grossly incomplete. Even fairly recent times, the vast majority of information that gets transmitted ultimately doesn't survive in any form that can be accessed by people in the, in even the relatively recent future, right? And so, so much more is the case for past ages. If we get back into the pre-modern world, the record is really scant, right? And so this can be frustrating, and there are serious limitations to try to understand the past. But at the same time, working through that, thinking critically about it, taking the information that you have and trying to extract meaning from it, is an intellectual enterprise of the highest order and the most valuable type, right? And so, taking an incomplete record, reading closely, thinking about it, trying to understand what it all means, right? That is really what we are engaged in this history class. We're looking at ages where the record is quite incomplete, and we're trying to access certain information about it. We're trying to understand that information, understand the people on their own terms, and all of that. And this is important because, historians can ultimately make judgments about the past. And this is by way of application, right? We can decide who were the heroes and who were the villains. Now, that might be subject to different interpretation. People might disagree over these things. But we, in order to learn from the past, to quote the Harvard philosopher George Santayana, those who do not learn the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them, right? We have to ultimately form some kind of judgment. We should suspend that while we try to understand people on their own terms. But then, once we have done that, once we've understood why they did the things they did, we are free then, or we should feel free to say, yes, but what they did was wrong. Even under those circumstances, this was wrong. Or, this was right, and maybe this is misunderstood as something that was right given those circumstances, where that might not be obvious sort of at face value. Let's see, this next page, I've highlighted something here, okay. So he's talking about people have told stories, from the beginning of human societies, right? And what we can learn from those stories is that people had very different conceptions of the way that the world operated. And we will engage with that in our sources this semester. We will see time periods that are so different from ours. Honestly, even 20, 30 years ago is quite different. And I think we would be a little bit perplexed by some of the decisions made even in the relatively recent past. But when we're talking about hundreds of years ago, right, these people thought very differently. The world was different. And so kind of finding ourselves in that situation, swimming around in the historical sources, if you will, that can lead to, it can be puzzling initially, but it can lead to some really creative endeavors, right? Where we try to understand why people viewed the world the way they did, why they interpreted things the way they did, why they told the stories that they did, right? It's important for us, and I'll get into this in a subsequent video a little more, then that we need to, and this goes back, the tradition of this goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, to the historians Herodotus and Thucydides, where we have to access good sources, preferably people who were there, who witnessed the things that they're talking about, or at least had reliable evidence to use in describing these things, right? And so part of the historian's job is to evaluate their sources, what's coming from the past, to think about it productively and to decide whether the source is reliable. Or if the source isn't reliable for one thing, are there other questions we might ask about it? So that's, and I'll talk a little more about this, okay? One of the learning outcomes, the expected learning outcomes for the course as a history course is to understand cause and effect relationships. And so in this part that I've marked here, on the basis of fragmentary and imperfect evidence, historians make retroactive predictions or retrodictions about what probably happened in the past, and in so doing seek to define cause and effect relationships that make the flow of events understandable. Right? So this happened. Well, what led to that? Why did people act this way? What were they informed by? These are all questions that we will engage with, okay, in looking at these sources and looking at the events in question. And then we will ultimately have to decide, like, this is why they did the things they did, okay? He gets into history as identity here, but I want to move on to this part. This, I think, is the most important part of this chapter, okay, where he comes back to cause and effect relationships and making connections between, you know, the historical circumstances and the actions of the people who lived through those circumstances. There's a step-by-step process that he suggests here, and this is something that I, you know, will say more about, maybe put my own spin on it, but I want to start the conversation here. So if you take nothing else away from this particular video lecture, this, I think, is the most important thing. The first step we have to engage with is to ask the question, what happened? How did the historical actors behave? What did they do? To learn that, we have to read. We have to, you know, read the sources that come from the past. The people's own descriptions of what happened, in addition, perhaps, to what what historians, what subsequent people have said about it, how they've described it, but preferably going back to the primary sources, to the things that actually come from those circumstances. So we learn as much as we can about it, and then we ask the question, why? And I've highlighted the question, why. This is the most important question in the course, really, and this is the most important question that historians ask. Why did they do that? The answer should not be self-evident. It shouldn't be obvious, right? Asking why questions is really the nuts and bolts of what historians do, or what historical inquiry is all about. And then, you know, how did things turn out? Who benefited? Who suffered? Did the outcome make the effort worthwhile? That's where we can start to judge this, and even draw lessons from this that we can apply to the present, or at least do some comparison with what we do in the present, right? So hopefully this has been at least an introductory set of ideas that you can take with you into the course. Please read the Gilderhus closely if you haven't done so. If you have questions about this, we can talk about it in discussion boards. Feel free to reach out to me if you've got ideas or questions you'd like to discuss. Thanks.